The grand chandelier cast a golden glow over the ballroom, but all Ava could see was the man standing before her. Damien Sterling, the man who had destroyed her family's legacy, stolen everything her father had built, and left them in ruin. Yet here she was wearing his ring. "You're quiet," Damien murmured, his voice a deep, rich timbre that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers with practiced ease. "Regretting your decision already?" Ava lifted her chin, forcing a smirk. "Regret? No. Just thinking about how poetic this is. The man who took everything from me is now bound to me." Damien's lips curled into a half-smile, his grip tightening ever so slightly. "And you? Bound to me, Ava. Don't forget that." A flicker of defiance burned in her eyes. "Oh, I won't." The orchestra began a slow, haunting melody, and before she could pull away, Damien slid his hand to her waist, guiding her onto the dance floor. She stiffened at the contact. It should have been easy to hate him. She wanted to hate him. But the warmth of his palm against her back, the way his breath ghosted against her temple as he leaned in, it made everything feel dangerous. "You're tense," he observed, his voice amused. "Afraid of me?" Ava scoffed. "Afraid? No." "Disgusted? Maybe." He chuckled low and deep. "You're lying." She forced herself to glare up at him. "You think you know me? I know enough." His fingers traced slow, feather-light patterns against the small of her back, sending a traitorous heat through her veins. "Like how you want revenge, yet you tremble when I touch you." Ava swallowed, hating how her body betrayed her. She had vowed to break him, to make him suffer the way her family had suffered. But standing here, feeling the heat of his body against hers, hearing the quiet intensity in his voice, she wondered if she had underestimated the real danger. Because every kiss, every touch, was unraveling the hatred she had so carefully cultivated. And that terrified her more than anything. Ava tried to step back, to create distance, but Damien's grip was firm, his touch possessive. "Leaving so soon?" he murmured, his lips dangerously close to her ear. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced a cold smile. "Dancing with you wasn't part of the deal." "Neither was falling apart in my arms," he countered smoothly. Her breath hitched. "You're delusional." Damien's thumb brushed over the bare skin of her lower back, where the delicate fabric of her gown dipped scandalously low. His touch was electric, sending an unwanted thrill through her. "Am I?" His voice was velvet, smooth and laced with challenge. "Then tell me, Ava, why haven't you pulled away?" Her nails dug into his shoulder as she clenched her jaw. "Maybe I'm just waiting for the perfect moment to ruin you." His laughter was dark, a whisper of amusement against her skin. "Careful," he warned. "Playing with fire has consequences." Ava tilted her head up defiantly, locking eyes with him. "And what? You'll burn me?" "No," Damien murmured, his hand trailing upward, fingertips tracing the exposed curve of her spine. "I'll make you crave the flames." Ava's breath caught. Damn him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had come into this marriage with a plan, to seduce, to manipulate, to destroy him from the inside. But Damien was playing the game just as well, if not better. He leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers. "You want me to suffer," he whispered. "But tell me, Ava, when I kiss you, when I touch you like this, who's really losing?" Her pulse hammered as his lips brushed against hers, light, teasing, as if daring her to resist. Ava knew she should push him away, remind him that she wasn't his, that she would never be his. But her fingers betrayed her, tightening against the crisp fabric of his tux. And in that moment, she wasn't sure if she was breaking him, or if he was breaking her. Ava sucked in a sharp breath, her pulse erratic. No, she couldn't let this happen. She was here to ruin him, to make him suffer, not to fall into his trap. With every ounce of willpower, she pushed against his chest, creating just enough distance to regain control. "You think you're winning?" she taunted, tilting her chin up. "That a few lingering touches will make me forget what you've done?" Damien smirked, unshaken. "I don't need you to forget. I just need you to realize that this hatred of yours. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. It's starting to feel a lot like desire. Ava's stomach clenched, but she refused to let him see the effect he had on her. She forced a mocking laugh. That's adorable, Damien. Do you always confuse a well-played act for real emotions? His eyes darkened, amusement flickering into something deeper, something unreadable. If it's an act, you're dangerously close to convincing even yourself. Ava swallowed hard. You don't know me, don't I? His fingers ghosted over the pulse at her throat, as if testing how fast it raced. I know you're furious. I know you wake up every day thinking about how to destroy me. I know you tell yourself that this is just a game. He lifted her hand, bringing her knuckles to his lips. The warmth of his breath sent shivers through her. But I also know this, Ava. He pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her fingers, his gaze locked on hers. If I kissed you right now, you wouldn't stop me. Her entire body tensed, heat rising to her cheeks. She hated that he was right. Hated that a part of her wanted to know what it would feel like to let him ruin her in a way that had nothing to do with revenge. Ava yanked her hand back, her lips curling into a slow, dangerous smile. You're bold, I'll give you that. She took a step forward, closing the space between them once more, but this time, it was on her terms. She lifted her hand, trailing a single finger along the sharp line of his jaw. But you underestimate me. Damien remained still, watching her. Do I? She rose onto her toes, her breath fanning against his lips. Yes. Because when I finally destroy you, she let her lips just barely brush his before pulling away, her voice turning into a soft, lethal whisper. You won't even see it coming. Damien exhaled slowly, his eyes burning with something that looked dangerously close to admiration. I look forward to it. Ava turned on her heel, walking away, every step a calculated statement. But the problem was, her hands were still shaking, her heart still pounding. This was dangerous, because she had planned to break him. But now, she wasn't sure if she'd be able to walk away unscathed. Ava didn't stop walking until she reached the balcony, the cool night air biting against her heated skin. She gripped the marble railing, inhaling deeply. She needed to clear her head. She couldn't let him get to her. This was all part of the plan. Seduction. Manipulation. Revenge. But why did it feel like he was the one pulling her strings? You left too soon, came Damien's voice from behind her. Smooth, composed, like he hadn't just shattered her composure minutes ago. Ava didn't turn. Or maybe you followed too quickly. She heard him step closer, slow, deliberate movements. Then warmth, his presence at her back. Too close, too intoxicating. You're running. Ava scoffed, gripping the railing tighter. That would imply I'm afraid of you. He leaned in, his breath teasing the curve of her neck. Aren't you? A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to stay still. Of you? Please. She turned her head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. You're not as untouchable as you think, Damien. His smirk was infuriatingly confident. Neither are you, Mrs. Sterling. Ava's stomach clenched at the name. Don't call me that. But you are. His fingers brushed over the back of her hand, barely touching, yet setting every nerve in her body ablaze. You agreed to this marriage, after all. She turned fully now, facing him with all the strength she could muster. For my reasons, not yours. Damien tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. And what are your reasons, Ava? He took a step closer, eliminating the last of the space between them. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're playing a very dangerous game. Ava lifted a brow, ignoring the way his nearness made her pulse race. You should be the one worried. Games are only dangerous if you don't know how to play. A slow, knowing smile tugged at his lips. And you think you can outplay me? Ava smirked, tilting her head up to meet his gaze head-on. I know I can. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them thickened, the air crackling with something electric, something neither of them wanted to name. Then Damien reached out, his fingers trailing lightly down her arm before resting on her waist. His touch was possessive, effortless, like he already knew she wouldn't pull away. Ava should have. She should have stepped back, reminded him that she was the one in control. But she didn't. His other hand came up, tracing along her jaw, his thumb brushing over her bottom lip. "Then prove it," he whispered, his voice dark and full of challenge. Ava's breath hitched. And then, she did the only thing she could. She grabbed the back of his neck and pulled him down, crashing her lips against his.
She had meant it as a test.
A way to prove that she was the one in control. But the second their lips met, she realized her mistake. Because Damien didn't hesitate. He responded with equal force, his hand tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss, taking control just as quickly as she had tried to claim it. Heat coiled in her stomach, her pulse roaring in her ears. Every ounce of hatred, of frustration, of desire, twisted into this moment. And the worst part? She liked it. The kiss was fire and fury, a battle neither of them wanted to lose. Damien's grip tightened, his fingers threading through her hair as he angled her head, deepening the kiss like he had all the time in the world to ruin her. Ava should have pulled away. She meant to pull away. But her body betrayed her. Her fingers curled into his shirt, gripping him like he was the only thing keeping her steady. His scent, dark spice and something inherently him, wrapped around her, pulling her deeper, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Then Damien shifted, pressing her back against the cool stone of the balcony. His body was firm, solid against hers, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of her gown. "Ava," he murmured against her lips, her name a sinful caress. The sound of it snapped something inside her.
No.
This wasn't part of the plan. She came here to destroy him, not to want him. With a sharp breath, Ava shoved against his chest. Not gently. Hard. Damien stepped back immediately, his breathing unsteady, his lips slightly parted as if he was just as shaken as she was. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, as if she could erase the feeling of him. That, she forced a smirk, her heart still hammering, was disappointing. A slow, wicked smile spread across Damien's face. "You're lying." Ava crossed her arms, feigning nonchalance. "You really think I'd fall for you, Damien?" He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a move that sent a fresh wave of heat through her, he leaned in just enough that his lips barely grazed her ear. "You already are." Ava's stomach flipped violently, but she refused to let him see it. She laughed, stepping around him, putting much-needed distance between them. "Keep dreaming." Damien turned, watching her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Oh, I will. And when you finally stop pretending." He smirked. "You'll be the one begging me to finish what we started." Ava swallowed hard, forcing a scoff. "You're delusional." He didn't argue, just smiled, like he knew something she didn't. Infuriating. She spun on her heel, walking away, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be breaking him. So, why did it feel like she was the one unraveling? Ava stormed through the grand hallway of the estate, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She needed to clear her head. She needed distance. Her hands were still trembling. Damn him. She had kissed him to prove a point, to take control of the game, to show him she was unaffected. But instead, she had lost herself in it. The way he touched her, the way he kissed her back like he knew all her weaknesses, it had unraveled something dangerous inside her.
No.
She wouldn't let him win. Reaching her bedroom, she slammed the door shut and pressed her back against it, forcing steady breaths. She was still in control. She had to be. Then, 3 sharp knocks. Ava's stomach clenched. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. She hesitated for half a second, then schooled her expression into indifference before unlocking it. Damien stood in the doorway, looking too composed, his lips curved in that infuriating, knowing smirk. "Problem, Mrs. Sterling?" Ava's grip tightened on the door handle. "Unless you want me to slam this door in your face, I suggest you leave. Damien leaned against the frame, crossing his arms. You could. His gaze flickered to her lips, a slow, calculated movement. But we both know you won't. Her pulse jumped, but she narrowed her eyes. You're awfully confident for someone I just walked away from. His smirk deepened. You didn't walk away. He stepped forward, and for some reason, she was the one who stepped back. You ran. Ava lifted her chin. I lost interest. Damien studied her for a long moment, then reached out, slow, deliberate, and traced a single finger down the length of her arm. Your body tells a different story. Ava smacked his hand away. Touch me again, and I'll break your fingers. Damien chuckled. Feisty. Then his expression turned thoughtful. Tell me something, Ava. What's your endgame? Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because she had an answer. She was supposed to marry him, get close, tear him down from the inside, make him suffer. And yet, nothing to say? Damien murmured. Ava exhaled sharply, forcing a smirk. You'll find out soon enough. His gaze darkened, but instead of pushing, he stepped back. I look forward to it. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Ava standing in her doorway, feeling like she had just lost another battle she didn't even know she was fighting. Ava didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, fingers curled tightly around a glass of wine she hadn't even touched. Her plan was simple. Get close, gain his trust, and tear him apart from the inside. But Damien was supposed to be easier to hate. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remember. This was the man who ruined her family, who destroyed everything her father built, who stood at the top while she clawed her way out of the rubble. She had agreed to marry him for one reason: revenge. And yet, every time he looked at her like he knew her, like he saw past her armor, it made her feel like she was the one losing. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She inhaled slowly, masking every ounce of weakness before opening it. And there he was. Damien leaned casually against the doorframe, dressed in nothing but a black silk robe that hung loosely over his broad shoulders, exposing the sharp lines of his collarbone and a hint of his chest. He looked too at ease, like he belonged there, like he owned every inch of the space between them. Ava forced her gaze to his eyes. It's late. Couldn't sleep, he said, his voice low, smooth. Thought I'd see if my wife had the same problem. She folded her arms, refusing to acknowledge the way the word wife sent an unfamiliar heat through her. Go back to your room, Damien. He took a step closer.
Why?
Afraid of what might happen if I don't. Ava scoffed. Afraid? Of you. She tilted her chin up. I think you have this all wrong. Damien hummed, eyes glinting with amusement. Do I? Before she could answer, he reached out, his fingers barely grazing her wrist, featherlight but enough to send a shiver up her spine. A test. A challenge. Ava swallowed. Whatever game you think you're playing, it won't work on me. He leaned in slightly, his voice a dangerous whisper. That's the problem, Ava. You're already playing. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move. She wouldn't let him win. With calculated slowness, she reached out, mirroring his touch, her fingers tracing along his forearm, feeling the heat of his skin. She stepped closer, closing the space between them until her lips were just a breath away from his. If you think this is getting to me, she murmured, her voice laced with cold amusement, then you're the one losing. Damien exhaled a quiet laugh, but there was something darker in his eyes now, something unreadable. Maybe. His hand ghosted over her waist before he pulled back completely, his expression unreadable. We'll see who breaks first. Then, just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the dim hallway, pulse hammering. Ava clenched her fists. She needed to regain control. Because if she wasn't careful, she was going to be the one ruined. Ava spent the next day reminding herself who she was. She dressed in her sharpest, most elegant outfit, a deep emerald silk dress that hugged her figure, paired with heels that clicked with purpose against the marble floors. If Damien wanted to play games, she would show him exactly who he was up against. She found him in the private dining room, sipping coffee like he hadn't spent the night crawling under her skin. "Good morning, wife," he greeted smoothly, setting his cup down. Ava slid into the seat opposite him, crossing one leg over the other. "I wasn't aware we were pretending to be a happy couple." Damien smirked. "Aren't we?" She ignored the way his eyes swept over her, slow and assessing. Instead, she reached for her coffee, taking a deliberate sip before meeting his gaze. "If you're expecting me to play the doting wife, you're going to be very disappointed." He tilted his head. "Who said I was disappointed?" Ava narrowed her eyes, but before she could respond, a maid entered, placing a plate in front of her. She hadn't even ordered breakfast, but the moment she looked down at the meal, her favorite, perfectly made, her stomach twisted. She glanced back at Damien, who was casually buttering his toast, completely unbothered. "You had them make this," she said flatly. His smirk didn't fade. "I am your husband, Ava. It's only right I know what you like." Her grip on the fork tightened. "How thoughtful." He hummed, taking a sip of coffee. "You look beautiful, by the way." Ava rolled her eyes, forcing herself to focus on her meal instead of the way his voice curled around words like silk. "Flattery won't get you anywhere." Damien leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp, piercing. "Who said I needed to?" Her pulse skipped before she could stop it. "Damn him." Ava set her fork down, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "You think you're winning?" His smirk deepened. "Aren't I?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "We'll see about that." Before he could respond, she pushed back her chair and stood, smoothing out her dress. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her tone light, almost amused. "I have important matters to attend to." She didn't give him the satisfaction of waiting for a response. Instead, she walked out, her steps slow, deliberate. She could feel his eyes on her. Good. Let him think she was affected. Let him believe he had the upper hand. Because the next time they faced off, she would make sure he was the one left breathless. Ava spent the rest of the morning planning her next step. If she was going to bring Damien down, she needed leverage, something he cared about, something she could twist to her advantage. And she knew exactly where to start. His company. Sterling Enterprises wasn't just an empire, it was his empire. Damien had built it into an untouchable force, expanding its power across multiple industries. But no empire was truly invincible. She just had to find the cracks. Ava sat in her private study, scrolling through reports, financial statements, and board member profiles, searching for an opening. And then, a knock at the door. She took a slow breath, already knowing who it was. "Come in." Damien stepped inside, looking as composed as ever. Dressed in a crisp black suit, his tie slightly loosened like he'd just come from a meeting. He took one glance at her desk, where reports were spread out, and his smirk was immediate. "Plotting my downfall already?" Ava leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Should I be more discreet?" He chuckled, walking toward her. "You'd like me to think you're searching for a weakness, wouldn't you?" He stopped in front of her desk, resting his hands on the polished wood. "But the truth is, you're realizing how difficult that will be." Ava refused to let her expression falter. "Everyone has weaknesses." Damien studied her for a moment before rounding the desk, moving behind her chair. She didn't move, didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting, even when she felt the heat of him so close. Then his hands skimmed down the arms of her chair, caging her in. A calculated move. A test. "I wonder," his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "When you finally find my weakness, will you have the strength to use it?" Ava's breath caught, but she masked it with a quiet laugh. "You think I won't?" His lips brushed the shell of her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "I think you already hesitate." Her nails dug into the leather of her chair. "You don't know me as well as you think." Damien's fingers ghosted along the edge of the desk before he pulled back, stepping away completely. "We'll see." Ava exhaled slowly, regaining her composure as she turned to face him. "You're awfully confident for someone who has no idea what I'm capable of." Damien smirked. I think I have an idea. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket, pulling out an invitation and placing it on her desk. A gala? Ava arched a brow, picking it up. How romantic. It's business, he said smoothly. And as my wife, you'll be attending. She set the invitation down, tilting her head. Let me guess, some powerful investors, a few important deals? He nodded. And the perfect opportunity for you to put on that charming smile of yours. Ava smiled, slow and dangerous. I can be very charming. I know. His gaze flickered to her lips before he turned to leave. Wear something stunning. Then, just like that, he was gone, leaving Ava gripping the invitation, heart pounding. This was an opportunity. In a room full of power players, there had to be someone who had reason to turn against Damien. Someone she could use. If Damien thought she'd just be his obedient wife on his arm, he was in for a surprise. Ava spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the gala, a night that would be as much about corporate chess as it was about personal conquest. In her private dressing room, she studied her reflection. She had chosen a deep sapphire gown that clung to her curves with calculated allure, a perfect blend of elegance and danger. Tonight, she wasn't just playing the role of the dutiful wife. She was a strategist with a vendetta. A knock came at the door, soft yet insistent. Before she could answer, the door swung open to reveal her trusted confidant, Elise, a sharp-witted legal advisor with a knack for uncovering corporate skeletons. Are you sure about this? Elise asked in a hushed tone, closing the door behind her. Ava's eyes flashed with determination. This is the perfect opportunity. I've been poring over Sterling Enterprises files. There's a vulnerability, a secret project that wasn't meant to leave the boardroom. She spread out a series of documents on the vanity table, the printouts catching the low light. Elise leaned in, scanning the documents. This could bring his empire crashing down if the right people know. But you need someone on the inside. Ava nodded. I already have a few contacts among his investors. Tonight, I'll charm them. I'll plant the seeds of doubt. And if any questions arise, I'll be the one with all the answers. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Ava knew this wasn't just about business. It was about reclaiming the power that Damien thought he held over her. A soft chime signaled the arrival of a chauffeur outside. Elise gave a knowing smile. Time to go break a few hearts and some corporate records. As they stepped out into the cool night, the imposing mansion that was Sterling Enterprises glimmered with anticipation. Inside, the gala was already in full swing. The grand hall buzzed with influential figures mingling under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers and the murmur of hushed conversations. Ava's entrance turned heads. Damien was at the far end of the room, surrounded by well-dressed investors. When his gaze landed on her, his eyes narrowed momentarily, a flicker of surprise before his confident smile returned. Making her way through the crowd, Ava moved with purpose. Every step was calculated, every glance measured. Investors paused to compliment her, drawn in by her charm and the mysterious edge in her eyes. With each conversation, she steered the dialogue towards Damien's recent corporate decisions, hinting at irregularities and missteps. At one table, a well-respected venture capitalist leaned in. I heard rumors about a failed project, something about unauthorized expenditures at Sterling Enterprises? Ava's smile was enigmatic. Rumors, darling, can often be the whispers of truth waiting to be revealed. Wouldn't you agree? Her tone was both playful and provocative, leaving the question hanging in the air like a promise. Across the room, Damien observed silently, his eyes dark and calculating. He knew Ava was playing her own game tonight, a game where every word could shift the balance of power. Moments later, as the music swelled and the room's energy heightened, Damien made his way towards her. In the center of a semicircle of influential guests, he addressed her directly. Ava, you seem to be enjoying the spotlight tonight. She met his gaze with a cool smile, her voice steady. I'm simply being a good hostess, Damien, making sure our esteemed guests are well informed. His eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, the tension between them was palpable, a silent duel of wits and wills. I trust you know how important loyalty is in our family, our empire, he said, his tone layered with both charm and a veiled challenge. Ava stepped closer, her voice low and confident enough for only him and those nearby to hear. Loyalty isn't blind devotion. It's about knowing when to act, when to strike. And tonight, I believe we both have much to learn. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. In that charged moment, every attendee sensed that something monumental was about to unfold, a shifting of alliances, the cracking of a once impenetrable facade. Damien's gaze softened slightly, as if recognizing the fire in her words. Then, let's see who truly commands a room. With those words hanging in the air, Ava and Damien continued their intricate dance, each move laden with promise and peril. Tonight wasn't just about power, it was about rewriting the rules of their deadly, seductive game. Ava knew how to command attention. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the way investors, board members, and power players hung onto her words, captivated by the poised, enigmatic woman standing at Damien Sterling's side. But she wasn't at his side. She was working against him, slowly and carefully planting the seeds of doubt, feeding whispers of corporate missteps into the ears of those who mattered. Damien had built an empire of steel.
She was going to rust it from the inside.
Yet, as she held his gaze across the room, she knew he was watching her just as closely. She had expected him to be irritated, to be wary of her maneuvering, but instead,
He looked amused.
that was her first warning. The second came when a waiter discreetly placed a note into her palm as she reached for her champagne. Library. 5 minutes. Don't make me wait, wife. A slow exhale. A pulse of irritation. Damien was testing her. Again. Ava took her time. She finished her drink, exchanged a few more hushed words with a well-placed investor, and only then, when she was certain Damien had been left waiting, did she make her way through the grand hall, slipping past the crowd toward the library. The room was dimly lit, lined with dark mahogany shelves stacked with books older than she was. A single glass of whiskey sat untouched on the desk, and Damien stood by the fireplace, hands in his pockets, watching her with that infuriating smirk. Took you long enough. Ava arched a brow. I had more important matters to attend to. His smirk deepened. I notice. She crossed the room slowly, unhurried. If you're here to remind me of my role as your wife, spare me the speech. Damien let out a quiet chuckle. I think you misunderstand me, Ava. He stepped closer, his presence dark and magnetic. I don't want obedience. His fingers brushed against her wrist, light enough to make her skin burn. I want to see how far you're willing to go. Her pulse betrayed her. She could feel it against her throat, quickening despite every effort to remain unaffected. I don't break that easily, Damien. He tilted his head, eyes flickering with something unreadable. I don't want to break you. He leaned in, his voice low, taunting. I want to see what happens when you finally stop pretending you hate this. Ava refused to let him win. She stepped forward, pressing a hand to his chest, not to push him away, but to pull him in just enough that he thought he was winning. Then she smiled, slow and deliberate. I'll stop pretending, she murmured, her lips just a breath away from his, the moment you do. For the first time, Damien's smirk faltered. Just slightly. But Ava saw it. And it was enough. She pulled back before he could reclaim control, before he could turn the moment into one of his victories. Enjoy the rest of your evening, she said smoothly, turning toward the door. Before she could step out, his voice reached her, softer this time. This isn't a game you can win, Ava. She paused, just briefly, before glancing over her shoulder. That's what makes it fun. Then she left, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Because for the first time she wondered who was truly playing who. The next morning, Ava expected retaliation. Damien was many things, ruthless, intelligent, and maddeningly composed, but he was never passive. If she had managed to shake him last night, even for a second, he would make sure she felt the consequences. She just didn't expect him to strike so soon. Ava stepped into her private study, coffee in hand, prepared to go over the information Elise had gathered. But the moment she opened her laptop, an email notification flashed across the screen. From Damien Sterling. Subject: Consider this my move. Her stomach tightened. She clicked it open, scanning the brief message. Your private account is frozen. I assume you'll be reaching out to Elise for solutions, but don't bother. She's already aware. Our finances are merged, love. Careful where you step next. Ava's fingers curled around her coffee cup, but her grip was steady. She read the email twice, absorbing every calculated word. So, he wanted to remind her who held the power. A slow exhale.
She wouldn't panic.
That's what he wanted. Before she could respond, a knock came at her door. Elise walked in, looking unusually tense. You saw the email, Elise said without preamble. I did. And Ava set her coffee down and met Elise's gaze. He thinks this will corner me. A pause. Then a slow, knowing smile. But he's forgotten one thing. Elise folded her arms. And what's that? Ava leaned back in her chair, confidence settling into her bones. I never intended to fight him fair. Elise's lips twitched. What's the plan? Ava reached for her phone, already dialing. We shift tactics. If Damien wants to remind me of the power he holds. The call connected. A familiar voice answered. Darling, Ava said smoothly, her smile sharpening. I think it's time we had lunch. Elise's brows lifted as Ava ended the call. Who was that? Ava's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. His biggest competitor. Later that evening, Damien arrived home later than usual. He had expected some kind of retaliation from Ava, perhaps an icy silence, maybe an argument. What he hadn't expected was the sight of her lounging in the dimly lit living room, a glass of wine in hand, legs crossed with effortless grace. She looked up as he entered, her lips curving in a way that made his instincts sharpen. You've been busy, she said, voice smooth as silk. So have you, he countered. Her smile didn't waver. Had lunch with an old friend. She tilted her head. You remember James Calloway, don't you? Damien stilled. James Calloway, CEO of Calloway Industries. A man Damien had crushed in a ruthless takeover attempt just 3 years ago. A man with a long memory and a thirst for revenge. Ava watched the flicker of recognition in Damien's eyes. You went to Calloway, he said, voice unreadable. She took a slow sip of wine. I wonder how he'd feel if he knew Sterling Enterprises was suffering a few financial inconsistencies. Silence. Then, to her surprise, Damien chuckled. It wasn't the reaction she expected. It was quiet, dark amusement, like he had been waiting for this moment. You want to play at my level? He murmured, stepping forward. Ava held her ground. I'm already there. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was deceptively gentle, his fingers trailing just slightly against her skin before he leaned in, his lips brushing dangerously close to her jaw. You just made things interesting, he murmured. Ava's breath hitched before she could stop it. Then he pulled back, his smirk firmly in place. Be careful, love. He turned toward the stairs, leaving her with a single parting shot. I don't play fair either. Ava sat there, her heart hammering, her wine forgotten. She had drawn blood, but the game was far from over. Ava had played her move. Now, she had to be ready for Damien's counterstrike. She expected retaliation. She just didn't expect it to be so personal. The next morning, as she stepped into the office she used within Sterling Enterprises, her assistant rushed toward her, looking pale. Mrs. Sterling, the woman said hesitantly, handing Ava a printed document. This was just made public. Ava's eyes flicked to the headline. Ava Sterling, the woman behind the man, or the one who wants to tear him down. Her stomach clenched. She scanned the article, her name laced with accusations of corporate manipulation. It painted her as an ambitious, power-hungry woman who had married Damien for influence, only to attempt to betray him from within. The most damning part? It hinted at insider dealings between her and James Calloway. A setup. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Who leaked this? She asked, though she already knew. Sterling Enterprises' PR team is already handling the fallout, her assistant murmured. But some investors are starting to question their confidence in you. A calculated strike. Not just against her, but against her reputation. Ava inhaled deeply, smoothing out the paper before placing it on the desk. She knew Damien's tactics. This was his warning. But she wasn't done. She turned on her heel, striding toward Damien's office. His assistant barely had time to stand before Ava pushed open the doors without knocking. Damien sat behind his desk, calm as ever, swirling a glass of whiskey despite the early hour. "I assume you've seen the news," he said casually, not bothering to look up. Ava closed the door behind her with a quiet click. "You really don't like losing, do you?" Damien finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Neither do you." She stepped forward. "You think ruining my reputation will make me back down?" His smirk returned. "I think it'll remind you where you stand." Ava studied him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, not just victory but something darker. Something conflicted. And then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Soft at first, then sharper, laced with something dangerous. Damien's smirk faltered. "Something funny?" Ava leaned down, resting her hands on his desk as she met his gaze head-on. "You want to destroy me?" she murmured. "You should have done it before I learned how to fight you." He didn't respond. She straightened. "Your move, love." Then she walked away, leaving him staring after her. Ava spent the next 24 hours turning the narrative in her favor. She made a single call to a trusted journalist. By morning, a new article was circulating. Ava Sterling strikes back. The woman Damien Sterling underestimated. The piece painted her not as a betrayer, but as a force within Sterling Enterprises, someone who had been defending the company from dangerous deals Damien himself was pursuing. It exposed the truth, that he had frozen her accounts, that he had manipulated the press against her. The public loved a woman who refused to be silenced. By noon, Sterling Enterprises stock had stabilized. Board members were murmuring, maybe Ava Sterling was the real power in this marriage.
And Damien?
He was waiting for her when she returned home that evening. She stepped inside, slipping off her coat, unsurprised to find him leaning against the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. "You played well," he admitted, watching her. She shrugged, stepping toward him. "You underestimated me." He smirked. "I hoped you'd fight back." She arched a brow. "You wanted this?" He stepped closer, their bodies inches apart. "I wanted to know how far you'd go to beat me." His fingers brushed against her wrist, trailing up to her pulse. "And now I know." Ava's breath hitched, because in that moment, she realized something terrifying. She had wanted to break him, but somewhere along the way, she had started wanting this. Him. The fire. The fight. The way they matched each other blow for blow. "You think this means you've won?" she murmured. His lips curved. "I think we both have." His hand curled around the back of her neck, pulling her in. And this time, when she kissed him, it wasn't just part of the game. It was real. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most dangerous thing of all. 1 year later, the world had expected their marriage to collapse. Board members, journalists, even close allies had whispered about inevitable destruction. Damien and Ava Sterling were too ruthless, too sharp-edged to coexist, without eventually cutting each other to pieces. But what none of them understood was, they had already bled, and neither had any intention of walking away. Ava stood on the balcony of their penthouse. The city sprawled beneath her like an empire waiting to be ruled. The wind toyed with the silk of her dress as she sipped from a glass of wine, eyes scanning the glowing skyline. Behind her, Damien's footsteps were quiet, but she felt his presence long before he spoke. "You should be celebrating," he murmured, his voice rich with amusement. Ava smirked, tilting her head just slightly as he stepped behind her, his fingers brushing over the bare skin of her shoulder. "I don't celebrate expectations being met." Sterling Enterprises was now untouchable. After months of boardroom battles and backroom deals, the world had finally accepted what Damien and Ava had known all along. They were stronger together. His empire, once entirely his own, was now theirs. "Then let's talk about the unexpected," Damien murmured, trailing a hand down her arm. Like the fact that Calloway just sold the last of his shares and retired to some island far, far away. Ava chuckled. Running was the only option left to him. Or, Damien continued, his lips brushing against her ear, the fact that certain board members who tried to push you out are now sending you desperate proposals. Ava turned slightly, meeting his gaze. And what about you? She mused, eyes gleaming. You were prepared to ruin me, Damien. He smirked. And yet here we are. They had gone to war with each other. Fought, manipulated, and pushed until they reached the brink of destruction. And then, somehow, they had chosen to build from the ruins instead. Ava studied him, the man she had once sworn to break. He was still ruthless, still dangerous, still every inch the power-hungry bastard she had married. But she had never wanted to change him. She had only wanted to prove that she could stand beside him without bending. And she had. Damien ran a finger down the curve of her jaw, his voice quieter now. No regrets. Ava leaned in, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to the corner of his mouth. Not one. His smirk returned. Good. He turned her fully in his arms, pulling her against him. The city lights gleamed behind them, but neither of them looked away from each other. They had lost. They had won. And now they ruled. Together. Thanks for watching. For more stories, please subscribe Eververse Novel.